Fulton Sheen, God and the Intelligence. Chapter 13, The Spirit of Modern Philosophy. We now pass to state our fundamental criticism of the whole spirit of contemporary philosophy on this subject in the light of the age-long traditional principles. Our basic principles are contracted from the doctrines of Aristotle and St. Thomas, principles whose sole claim to be the accepted are their accord with common sense and not their authority. In the 10th book of Aristotle's Metaphysics, and in the first question of De Veritate, we find the principles upon which the spirit of modern thought will be judged. These principles are: 1. The term measure is a term strictly applicable to quantity. Here it is applied to an analogical sense. God is the measure of all things, in that He has ordered all things in measure and number and weight. The measure is the substance, whose end is determined by its constitutive principles. The number is the species. To add or subtract from a number is to change it. To add or subtract a substantial element from a species is to destroy it, e.g., to add animality to mineral life. The weight is inclination and love. Love is to rational beings what the law of gravitation is to bodies. Matter is drawn to the center of the earth. Reason is drawn to its source, God. Amor meus pondus meum, in the words of St. Augustine. Yet God, in turn, is measured by no one. He is first cause and uncaused, and thus, having never received his existence from another, he has not been measured by another. He has set the bounds to all created being, yet no one has set bounds to his being. 2. Natural things are both a measure and a thing measured. They are, first of all, a measure, for they determine our knowledge. The object which I see determines my knowledge of that object. Though natural things enjoy a reflected likeness of God, they measure us proximately, as God measures us absolutely. They, however, bear the stamp of their imperfection, for they, too, are measured. God has made them, set limits to them, and gives them their measure of existence. 3. The human intellect is a thing measured, not a measure. It is measured first of all by God, who has given it its first principle of the speculative and the practical order. It is also measured by things. The intellect does not give truth and goodness to things. It discovers them in things. Only in the case of artificial things can man be said to be a measure, and to this extent he reflects the Creator who made him. The architect is the measure of the house which it builds. The sculptor is the measure of the statue which he chisels. In a greater way, God is the cause and the measure of all things, so far as natural things are concerned, and this is our present interest. Man is not a measurer, he is a thing measured. These three principles are at the basis of common sense philosophy, and their proof, as we have shown, is ultimately reducible to the principle of contradiction. Not only philosophy, but even religion itself reposes on these principles, for they determine the relations of God and man. To change them is to change the whole fabric of our thought, and to substitute a series of relations which pervert the real order of things. In face of these principles, the spirit of modern thought is clear. After reviewing that thought in its characteristic statements and conclusions, we may now suggest its fundamental principles in terms of our own system. Possibly the philosophers who are thus criticized would be the first to say that our conclusions were not theirs, and that they were not aware of the attributed and implications lie deeply embedded in the nature, expressions, and structure of their tenets. What common sense philosophy attributes to the human intellect, modern philosophy attributes to the divine intellect, and what common sense philosophy attributes to the divine intellect, modern philosophy attributes to the human intellect. Putting their formula in the same terms as the common sense formula, it reads as follows: the human intellect is a measure, and not a thing measured. The divine intellect is a thing measured, and not a measure. Its first principle, in other words, is the superiority of the mind over being. Its second principle is the superiority of man over God. One has as its consequence the divinization of man, the other the humanization of God. These two results are not diverse, they are reciprocal. One is the concave and the other is the convex side of the same reality. The divinization of man means always the humanization of God. This is true of nations and individuals. At the point in history of a people or the history of a soul when man stresses unduly his own powers and self-sufficiency, faith is lost in both gods and God. John the Baptist, seized with the tremendous truth of this fact, cried out to his hearers beyond the Jordan, I must decrease and he must increase. And as man takes on an added and undue gravity from an undue estimation of his worth, God naturally becomes less in his estimation. Humility, on the contrary, is not so much an emphasis upon one's own insufficiency as it is upon God's worth and power. God becomes greater in our eyes according as we become less in our own. In either case, there is no change in God. The change is psychological and real, but in us. The first perversion of fundamental principle of the Philosophia Perennis is that man is the measure of all things. This anthropometrism and deification of man finds concrete expression in two principles underlying modern thought and asserting, respectively, a. the divinization of the human intelligence, and b. the divinization of human nature. A. The divinization of the human intelligence. The divinization of human intelligence is manifested in the boasting superiority of the human mind over being and truth, being and its transcendental measure thought. This is the position of the perennial philosophy. Thought measures being and its transcendentals. This is the position of a modern philosophy. We turn then to show in contemporary thought mind is made the measure of being and truth. 1. Mind is the measure of being. For Aristotle and his followers, mind is a tabula rasa upon which reality writes. Nothing is in the mind except that which was first in the sense and therefore in the objective reality. Mind is therefore not the measure of reality, so far as a man is concerned. Reality does not need to enter into a finite mind in order to exist. Even when reality does measure mind, reality is in no way modified. Only the subjective reality is affected, not the objective. Hence, there is no real relation existing between matter and mind, of being and mind. The only real relation exists between mind and matter, or mind and being, inasmuch as there is a causal dependence of the former on the latter. Intellectus humanus est mensuratus non mensurans. Modern thought, on the contrary, subverts this order of mind and being and makes mind a measure instead of thing measured. Whether it be idealism or empiricism, Both agree in this Kantian Copernican revolution. Reality is to some extent the work of the mind. The planets of reality revolve about the world of self. Mind is the measure of reality. But how, on these theories, does mind measure reality? Either by the use of priori forms native to the mind, and this is the idealist's answer, or by practical forms arising from need and utility, and this is the empirical answer. One is the modern interpretation of the first critique of Kant, and the other that of the second critique. Professor Ralph Barton Perry of Harvard has given the following principle as representative of idealism. The assertion of the priority of cognitive consciousness, the assertion that being is dependent upon the knowing of it, may be regarded as the cardinal principle of idealism. What, therefore, is real only in virtue of mind. That he has defined idealism well is evident from the words of the chief of English idealists. We perceive, on reflection, that to be real, or even barely to exist, must be to fall within sentience. Sentient experience, in short, is reality, and what is not this is not reality. We may say, in other words, that there is no real being or fact outside of that which is commonly called psychical experience. Feeling, thought, and volition, any groups under which we class psychical phenomena, are all the material of existence, and there is no other material, actual or even possible. This is by no means implies pure solipsism. The author contends, for there is no such thing as subject apart from reality. There is only one reality, of which all things else are but appearances. Nothing exists independently of it. This system of mind, which is, and which measures reality, is an absolute, but it is not God. God is only an appearance of reality. A God that can say to himself, I, as against you and me, is not, in my judgment, defensible as the last and the complete truth of metaphysics. For the empiricist of today, mind, too, is the measure of reality. But instead of mind being a single whole, it is taken to mean the combined activities of many minds in the long course of evolution. There is no ready-made world presented to us which we can suck in with passive receptivity. Professor Schiller tells us reality is not a fact in its own right which preexists the cognitive functioning. It is not something which measures our mind independently of any contribution which we may bring to it. We construct reality instead of being constructed by it. Our needs, utilize, and experience and conveniences are its determination and its measure. The priori forms of idealists give way to practical forms of action for the modern empiricist. Professor James goes on so far as to admit that these practical forms, which measure reality, may even antedate the appearance of real objects. Though the category of transcendental reality is now one of the foundations of our life, yet we can speculatively imagine a state of pure experience before the hypothesis of permanent objects behind its flux had been formed. And just so far as reality depends upon its mind may be said to be the measure and, in some sense, to be reality, if only that is real which is in thought, and if it is meaningless to speak of anything outside thought, then man has defied intelligence to the level of God's intelligence. A very happy reaction to this Protagorean philosophy has set in with neo-realism and critical realism. Neither, however, has created sufficient metaphysics to merit discussion here. At present, they confine themselves almost exclusively to the problem of sensible perception. 2. Mind as the measure of truth. Common sense philosophy has always maintained that truth, while involving mind of necessity, is not made or created by the mind. It in no way makes truth. It discovers truth. It does not manufacture it. Where is the ultimate source of that which it discovers? In the mind of God, truth resides firstly in the divine intelligence, which conceives eternally the ideas of its works. Secondly, it is found in things inasmuch as they are created in conformity with these eternal ideas. Thirdly, truth passes into human knowledge when it represents things as they are. Thus God measures truth just as things about us measure us. Thus we see that in the ontological order, in the order of real graduation and dependence among things, as distinct from the order of human experience, the reason why reality has ontological truth for the human mind is because it is essentially and antecedently in accord with the divine mind from which it derives its intelligibility. Modern philosophy has some accord with this traditional notion, at least at first sight. The source of truth for many is the other, but the other is not God, it is man, not as an individual, but as a stage in the evolutionary process. Ultimately, then man has become the measure and the source of truth. This is truth of the generality and pragmatic systems, and even of those absolutist systems which admit evolution of mind and truth. A man is the source of truth, considered from the point of view of evolution. Truth has a biological, not a divine source. Its source is not something transcendental to man. It becomes as man becomes. There is no such thing as a truth with a big T. Truths make themselves as we go. There are so many new creations that add themselves as fast as history proceeds, instead of being an antecedent principle that animates a process. Truth is but an abstract name for its results. The notion of a God as the source of truth is classed as a mere idol of the tribe. Mach simul Aveneris and Professor Schiller insist particularly on this man-made attitude of truth, just as our organs in the course of evolution acquire a certain fixity and stability and a certain biological immunity, so too do our truths. They are to be ultimately attributed to our ancestors. To speak of their source as residing outside the process of evolution is nonsense. It is what we make it. It is fruitless to define it by what it originally was or by what it is apart from us. Take man from out of evolutionary series, the truth automatically ceases to exist. Just as organic forms are born into the world, so is truth born with man. Suppress man, and you suppress truth. For St. Thomas, it is contrary. Suppress man, truth will continue to exist. Suppress angels, truth will continue to exist. But imagine that God were suppressed. Then, he concludes, truth would no longer exist. But to this the modern will answer, this notion of scholastic metaphysics was expedient for centuries, but human experience was boiled over its limits. B. Less remotely, truth has been made by the experience of the individual, considered not as the developing, but as developed. Human nature shapes all our questions. Human satisfactions lurk in all our answers. All our formulas have a human twist. But why have we come to recognize truths as man-made and not something coming from God? Professor James gives the answer. The enormously rapid multiplication of theories in these latter days has well nigh upset the notion of any one of them being a more literally objective kind of thing than another. There are so many geometries, so many logics, so many chemical hypotheses, so many classifications, each one of them good for so much and yet not good for anything, and that the notion that even the truest formulae may be a human device, and that a literal transcription has dawned upon us. Being devices, then, their measure will be their utility to us in handling the facts of experience. Subjective interests, our needs, our desires, will be at every step the measure of these truths. The measure will not be something objective. It will be that which satisfies us, or that which is expedient in the way of our thinking. If an idea works, then it is true. If theological ideas prove to have a value for concrete life, they will be true, for pragmatism is the sense that they are good for so much. If the hypothesis of God works satisfactorily in the widest sense of the word, experience shows that it certainly does work. It is true. If therefore at any time reason should come to prove the fallacy of some popular conclusion, and demonstrate conclusively that it was in contradiction to the fundamental laws of thought, pragmatism would keep it as a valuable error or a vital lie. Man, in the philosophical sense, is thus considered as an artist measuring not only artificial things, but even the universe itself. The universe that we can know and use is molded as potter's clay to the measure of the desires of man. Modern absolutist systems do not adopt this anthropomorphism with such boldness, at least the strictly philosophical part of it. But once the subject of God is introduced, man either implicitly or explicitly is made the measure. To judge or evaluate religion upon any other grounds than those of our own needs and desires is dangerous and mistaken. But without the sphere of absolutism, it is difficult to see wherein it can find the other by which truth can be measured. There is only one of which we are a part. On the common sense view, the many may be suppressed, world, man, and angels, yet there will still be truth. On absolutist position, if you suppress the many, world, men, and angels, you suppress the absolute. Ultimately, then, on the absolutist position, we are the measure. And we will continue this chapter in our next sitting.